This is not going to be my usual video. I have to do 3 things that I really don't like doing. The first one is punching down. I don't like going after smaller creators or really going after creators in general. I just want to talk about tech. But when something gets big enough and enough misinformation is being spread, especially when it's being targeted at me, sometimes you have to go set it right. And it's not something that I like to do, but right now it is basically necessary for us as a team to respond to the lies and slander that are currently being spread. Thing 2, and this one really hurts right now, defending Vercel. I know it seems like I'm the big Vercel fanboy, but I've lost way more money than I've ever made on Vercel, and tying them to my brand has hurt me immensely. On top of that, I've actually found Cloudflare nicer to work with overall recently. Shout out to Dane. He's been just on top of everything lately. We'll talk a lot about that in a very short amount of time. But then, thing 3, math. Oh boy, we have a lot to talk about today. So what's going on? Apparently, Cloudflare is 3 times faster than Vercel. This is a thing that I really wanted to look into, and according to another YouTuber.
So the test has finished. Man. Oh gosh. Theo should have at least either done his due diligence or kept his mouth shut.
Well, I'm going to do one of those things. Seriously, though, I have a lot of thoughts. I just spent far too much time benchmarking all of this. Shout out to Ben, channel manager, for helping me with this and helping me get the Svelte benches going. We made separate benchmarks for Next, React with vanilla SSR, straight up just rendering HTML on the server, as well as Svelte. And I put a couple math benchmarks in here as well, just to appease the guy that we'll be talking about. Normally, this is where I would make a joke about needing the money for a sponsor, but since the guy that we're talking about doesn't understand jokes, we're just going to cut straight to the ad. There are 2 harsh realities I've had to accept as I do more and more infrastructure work. The first is that the best solution isn't always on one cloud, so you often have to go multi-cloud. And the second is that keeping up with all of this sucks to do. It's just miserable making sure you're using the right solution for everything. And now you're hopping between things all of the time. You should just be shipping and writing code. And that's what today's sponsor is here to help with. Savala gets it. They're an all-in-one platform for everything you need for your infrastructure, and they're not just throwing this on some random cloud provider and wrapping it for you. They're integrating with multiple of them. Things like the CDN, DNS, and firewall is all handled on Cloudflare, but the actual servers and databases are handled on Google Cloud. They've built the abstraction for you so you can get back to work. If you're trying to ship servers and you're tired of all of the hassle, Savala is what you're looking for, almost certainly. You can deploy a new app by attaching a GitHub repo and choosing what branch you want it to deploy. It also works with GitLab and even Bitbucket, funny enough. Once you're deployed, you get automatic build pipelines and all the fancy things you expect for a modern dev platform. But more importantly, you can go make changes with single clicks. Let's say I want to start using the CDN for my static assets on this app. Settings, check, done. Now a CDN is being used for my app. It's that easy. They even tell you when they do and don't recommend turning on these things. If your app's highly dynamic, you probably shouldn't turn on the edge caching. This is a Laravel app, but you can deploy literally anything you can imagine. And I mean that when I say it. They have templates for everything from Django to Firecrawl to Moodle, the LMS, Mongo, Next.js, Pocketbase. I know a lot of people using this for Elixir too. Everything you could need and more. And of course, their bread and butter, WordPress. Savala knows WordPress incredibly well. That's their parent company, Kinsta's thing. From databases to apps to pipelines to CDNs to everything you need to ship your app, Savala has you covered. And they'll give you $50 of credit if you sign up today. Check them out now at soydev.link/Savala. If you haven't watched the video I'm responding to, that's fine. I promise you're not missing out on too much. Mostly just attacks on me for daring to make money and pay a team to run this channel. Crazy. But that aside, there was a lot of attention on this idea that I am lying when I say Vercel's performance is better than Cloudflare for CPU-bound tasks. So let's be very clear and concise about what we're talking about here. In almost every quote that he pulled from me, the statement I was making was very clear. For CPU-intensive server-side rendering tasks, Vercel is 2 to 6 times faster than Cloudflare. Apparently, this take of mine is entirely unresearched, unproven, and just me being a fanboy that's paid off into shill for no reason. This is annoying, because this is a point that I've researched in the past. It's a benchmark that I've run in the past, and I took the time to benchmark it again, a very detailed set of benchmarks actually, and I published it all open source for anybody to look at, rerun, and deploy themselves if you want to try it out too. The benchmark mentioned in that original video is interesting. The test is here. According to the author, this is a minimal, realistic benchmark to compare compute performance of different serverless and edge computing platforms. This is the realistic example that he used for this benchmark. It computes a sine and a cosine, which means it's doing floating point math. It runs 100 million times, and then it returns a result. Another fun thing you might not know is that some of the code in this straight up just doesn't work. In his CPU intensive function here, he has a performance.now call and one more at the end, because it lets you calculate how much time was spent on a given task. Seems simple enough, right? Well, fun fact on that, you can't actually use performance.now on Cloudflare because of side channel attacks. This is going to require a little bit of a deep dive. I'm sorry for nerding out this much on CPU architecture stuff, but we should first understand the difference in how these platforms work. If we think of all the things on our computer like a stack, and on the bottom here we have the actual hardware, so we'll just say it's the CPU. On top of that we have the kernel, host, whatever you want to call it. Then you have effectively like a hypervisor layer. I'm just going to call it the OS. Then again, we're in JavaScript land. So here we'll have our JavaScript engine. I'll just say V8 because it's easier. And then at the very tippity top here, we have your code. Put code there. So this is the stack, the hierarchy of when your code runs, all of the layers that it goes through. And if every single person was to run everything on their own server with everything provisioned like this themselves, you would theoretically have slightly better performance, but you'd also have a lot of time where this box is sitting doing nothing if you ever don't have traffic. As such, as an industry, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to split this up a bit so that we can run more things on a box and share stuff better. The two main methods we'll be talking about here are Cloudflare's workerd. This is the name of their runtime isolate layer, whatever you want to call it, versus Lambda or Firecracker, if you're caring about the actual open source like implementation layer for it. The difference between these two is where they are implemented. Lambda is effectively implemented here, where you would run a virtual operating system through something like Docker between the actual operating system and wherever your runtime is. So you'd be inserting a layer here that's a virtualized OS in order to keep whatever you're doing separate from other things on the machine. Versus workerd, which is a layer higher. They're not isolating at the operating system level. They're isolating above V8. When you're running a browser that uses V8 as the JavaScript engine, there are a lot of different things that can happen at the same time. Sometimes they're all in the same tab, sometimes they're in different tabs. More often than not, though, you want them to be separate. Cloudflare's went even further with this, taking the isolates and the idea of like workers inside of V8 and making them as isolated and separate as possible so that multiple different developers can ship code and it will run not just on the same computer, not just in the same VM, but in the same instance of V8 separated on the isolate layer. This is a big part of why Cloudflare can be so much cheaper because they're not spinning up an image in Docker for every single request every single user sends. They're just running a JavaScript file in an existing instance effectively. This is also why the performance characteristics are different across these. This is also why the resources available are different across these, where workerd is capped at like 128 megabytes of RAM, and you can run any amount you want on Firecracker, but in this case with Vercel, I have it set to 4 gigs. These types of things are very different because with Lambda, you're provisioning a VM, and with workerd and Cloudflare, you're just running code on an existing VM, multiple layers up the stack. And I really want to emphasize that point, the layer that we are operating within. The reason this matters in general is performance, but the reason this matters right now is the nature of how side channel attacks work. If you and I are running code in different Docker images, it's relatively hard for me to affect your Docker image from mine without having things exposed on either side. But if you and I are running code on the same instance of V8, there's a lot more potential for me to get a hold of things inside of your isolate. And as much work as Cloudflare has done, there are still things outside of their control that allow for exploitation to occur here. In particular, there was a series of attacks called Spectre that were attempts to use the speculation processes in modern CPUs to get across boundaries you're not supposed to. Effectively, a side channel attack using the timing of a given CPU. If I recall, this almost exclusively affected Intel processors. I don't feel like diving into all of the details here, even though I'm not the one who brought up AMD versus Intel, funny enough. Regardless of all that, Spectre is a vulnerability that you have to care a lot about when you're running different customers' stuff, different customers' code in particular, on the same machine. Since these are timing-based attacks, you can use things like performance.now to understand timing better and figure out where you can insert things to break out through the speculative side channel attack. As such, Cloudflare has chosen to freeze all calls to performance.now and date.now on anything that isn't IO bound. So if you do a bunch of math here, you call start and end, you will get a 0 out for this subtraction every single time. If you do something IO bound, like a fetch call or calling some internal Cloudflare service, then you'll actually get information because it won't update the value of performance.now until an IO boundary is hit. This shouldn't affect most people, but if you're like me and you're trying to run benchmarks, this fucking sucked. This means there's no way for us to benchmark how long a process actually takes on Cloudflare versus Vercel. We instead have to benchmark round trip time. And that sucks for a ton of different reasons, but I've done my best to mitigate those as I figure this out. And I've also spent a lot of time in the dashboards where you can kind of get this information, but there is no realistic way for me to see and send a response for how long something took on the server side on Cloudflare. You're wondering about Vercel? None of these problems. They're isolating at a virtual machine layer. You don't have to worry about Spectre attacks through that layer, as far as I understand. Let's take one last look at his benchmark because I think it's important to see the results he saw that led to him calling me all sorts of bad names. The results of his benchmark were interesting. He saw that for Cloudflare, the fastest response was around 9.1 seconds. The worst was 9.4 seconds. Average 9.3. Cool. Vercel, fastest was 37 to 38 seconds. Slowest was around 38 as well. Over 3 times slower. That's really bad. If that is the case, clearly I've been lying this whole time. I should not have talked any shit. Thankfully, there's a lot more to this story than the creator of the previous video might want you to believe. It is also of note that he used the standard size of function on Vercel, because unlike Cloudflare, you can control how much resource is available on Vercel. So if you are bottlenecked by performance, you should probably bump that up. As I mentioned, I made my own set of benchmarks. Let's quickly go over the implementation before we dive too deep on the results. Here is one of the pages that we're rendering as part of my benchmark suite. This one is using Next.js to render a complex server-side component. So this doesn't send any JavaScript down to the client to render these things. It's doing a big prime number selection, then a Fibonacci sequence, then a bunch of random items, and rendering all of this over and over again to be a complex rendering task on the server. The component just does a bunch of calculating of primes and Fibonacci's, random other data gen, and then renders it as a bunch of different components and JSX. This was built mostly by Claude as a way to hammer the render performance for React and make it complex to do a rendered output. I want to make sure we weren't just testing Next.js though, because I know Next is very much optimized for Vercel. Vercel makes Next.js, of course it is. We did use the official Cloudflare template for Next.js here via OpenNext. It's pretty nice to set up. Honestly, one of the biggest things I got out of this was a deeper appreciation for Wrangler. It's really good, and I like having a CLI that's a first-class citizen for managing all of this stuff, especially because the dashboard for Cloudflare is a bit of a rough experience. But I wanted to make sure we weren't just doing Next, so I actually took the time to write my own vanilla React SSR bench. So this one is a by-hand render to string call where I do a react.create element, making these like headers and then using the complex component. I didn't feel like dealing with JSX for this one. I wanted it to be buildless. So here I just have a bunch of react.create element calls. Did the same thing on Vercel, because again, just didn't feel like dealing with a build step. I also have a Svelte version. I don't know too much about this one. Ben wrote it, but he did his best to port the React bench there. We put it on Cloudflare and on Vercel. And I also did a vanilla bench. This one is not using any framework. It's just doing the same work and rendering it as stringed out HTML. This one ran too fast, so I ended up doing a custom version where it's way, way slower. And I have 2 different routes, one for each of those. Also of note in this version, though, is I put a couple additional pieces. So I have the /bench, I have /slower bench, but I also have 2 math benches. I have this one called shitty sine bench. You can probably guess what this one is. It just does a math sine versus cosine change here. CPU bound floating point. Wonder where I got that one from. And I have another one in here, a realistic math bench, because realistically speaking, if you are doing a bunch of complex floating point stuff, you're not doing that in fucking JavaScript on the server. If you're doing floating point in JS, it's so you can build a client-side experience that is a game or something. If you're doing it on the server, you're using Node wrong. Go use a real native language and just call it from your Node server if you really want to use Node for that. But like, nobody's doing this. And to go back 1 second to the split here, since Lambda, and in this case Vercel, are virtualizing the OS, you get full Node, which means full file system access, full like native code capabilities. You can pull in binaries from other languages that are compiled for Linux and run them and call them from inside of Node. Whereas with Workerd, you barely get half of Node's like built-in APIs supported, and they've had to re-implement a ton of stuff and polyfill a ton of stuff in order to make it work like at all with the modern environment. Cloudflare does not use Node. They might have surprisingly good Node compatibility considering that it's not Node, but it is not Node, which means you either have to use WASM or JavaScript for everything you do on Cloudflare workers, With Vercel, I can just go write some Go code or Rust code and run that in the same exact instance that is running my Node.js server. That's a huge difference. And the only reason you'd think that doing a bunch of floating point stuff is the way that you check how performant a JavaScript server is if you don't understand JavaScript or servers particularly well, which is why this whole thing is so frustrating. And then we have my realistic math bench, which isn't doing floating point stuff. It's just random arithmetic and bitwise operations instead. So now we see all of the benches that I made. What are the results? How did this pan out in the end? For my findings, Vercel is 1.2x to 5x faster than Cloudflare. Let's go through each bench quick. The Cloudflare next bench took about 1.9 seconds on average to render. Minimum was a little under a second. Maximum was 4 seconds, which makes it a 3-second variability. This is one of the biggest issues I had when I was doing Cloudflare tests with all of this. Cloudflare's variability on a lot of these things was insane. I actually did one last run before filming this because I was testing some things that Cloudflare had done. We'll talk about all that in a bit. They tried really hard to make these numbers as good as possible. So don't think I'm being biased here, didn't give anyone a chance. I worked with Cloudflare and Vercel to make sure we're highlighting both to the best of our ability. And after I did all of the changes they recommended on an account that they provisioned for me, Vercel was 5 times faster. Yeah. So that 2 to 6x range that I gave before, weirdly spot on considering that I'd done very minimal benching of these things. So that's Cloudflare versus Vercel on Next. But obviously, Next.js isn't everything. There are other frameworks. And if the previous video and the previous bench saw a 3x win for Cloudflare, maybe Vercel is just doing some magic because clearly their CPUs are slower, right? Well, let's look at the React SSR bench. Cloudflare's average runtime for this was almost half a second. Minimum was 0.2 seconds, and max was 1.4 seconds. Variability of 1.1 second. Vercel's mean was 0.14 seconds. Their minimum was 0.06 seconds, and their max was 0.6-ish seconds. That makes Vercel 3.5 times faster for the vanilla React SSR bench. I have my theories about why this is so much faster. We'll get to that in a bit. But right now, it's just showing React is better on Vercel. Obviously, Vercel just pays the React team a whole bunch. There's clearly bias there. They're probably gimping Cloudflare, right? Let's look at Svelte. Vercel is 2.59 times faster on SvelteKit. It is also quite funny how much faster the SvelteKit version rendered. We had to buff the rendering on this one up a bunch as well because, again, Svelte was so much faster than React for this type of gigantic server-side component render that it was hilarious. But Cloudflare is catching up a little bit. And now we have the shitty sign bench, the inspired by, well, copy-pasted from the other benchmark. And from my testing, the gap wasn't quite as big. I only saw a 1.5x gap with this. To be fair, when I ran this with the optimizations that the Cloudflare team made for me on my account, I saw that same 3x number that was being seen by the previous video. So that number can happen. I just don't think it will in super realistic scenarios. Hard to know for sure. But I guess if you are insisting on doing a bunch of floating point math on your server-side JavaScript code in an isolate without calling native code at all, Cloudflare could be a better solution for you. But if you're doing a more realistic math benchmark or actual server-side rendering, you will see consistently that Vercel is quite a bit faster. Okay, stop using frameworks. All those are bought by Vercel. What if you just render HTML on the server? Well, here we'll see it's actually quite close. About 1.06x faster on Vercel than on Cloudflare. I'll be honest, since these numbers are so low, chances are I'm more measuring variability of like the distance between me and the server I'm connecting to and how that changes on Cloudflare, because Cloudflare just kind of throws your code wherever, whereas with Vercel, I set it to the region that was closest to where I'm currently located. So ignore the gaps here. They're small for a reason. I would argue this one doesn't matter. I'm not even going to count this as a win for Vercel. They're within spitting distance. A couple things I want to make sure that we take note of here. The variability is a huge deal. Sometimes Cloudflare would respond in under 10 seconds. Sometimes it would respond in 50. In this test, there was a second of variability between the slowest and the fastest. And with the Next.js test, it was like 3 seconds of variability. I consistently saw this on both free tier and pro tier accounts. And funny enough, Ben had to have me deploy the SvelteKit version because on his free tier account, it kept timing out and freezing because of the restrictions on compute for free instances on Cloudflare. On Vercel, we had none of these issues. I know people are also going to complain that I was running the performance function environment on Vercel, not the standard one. That's the point. We're talking about extremes of performance. Even then, though, I did rerun these on standard and saw 10 to 30% hit on Vercel's performance across the board. It was not as big as I expected. I actually am probably going to move some things back to standard now that I know the gap isn't as big as I previously thought. So if all of this is the case, why would anyone use Cloudflare and not Vercel? Like, obviously Vercel is faster, as we've now established with a bunch of much closer to real workloads. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that these giant components are real workloads, but they much more represent the type of work that people will be doing on these things. And if you are doing this type of work and you want to make sure your pages respond in less than 2 seconds consistently, Vercel is a better option. So why would you ever pick this over Vercel? There's a couple big reasons, but the biggest by far is price. Cloudflare's system, by being virtualized higher up, is able to be both way cheaper and build in a more reasonable way, where they're not charging you for how long it takes for your function to respond. They're charging you for the amount of CPU used during that function call. That's a much better billing model for the types of AI workloads a lot of us are doing today, where we're just waiting for some third party to generate tokens that we can then forward to the user. Cloudflare is by design a significantly better platform for those types of things. I know I jokingly call them the world's greatest switch statement, but nowadays that's an essential piece of infra that a lot of businesses need and benefit greatly from. Vercel's base price per minute is already higher than Cloudflare, but the fact that they are billing by default on wall clock is terrifying. Thankfully, they have addressed that. I'm not sure how, because Lambda does bill on wall clock, and they're still technically built on top of Lambda. I would expect them to change out the compute layer at some point in the future. But that all said, the bill on Cloudflare still consistently comes out lower than the one that we see on Vercel for these types of long wall clock workloads. And the cost per minute is higher on Vercel with Lambda as well. Thankfully, Vercel's done some really cool stuff with Fluid Compute where they can reuse one Lambda for multiple requests at the same time. So it's actually cheaper to use Lambda on Vercel than on AWS directly for a majority of workloads. You can doubt me saying this all you want, but all the AWS Pro anti-Vercel people have said the same thing. Check out my video about Fluid Compute if you don't believe me. They all thought this was cool as hell. So price is the biggest reason. I've also found that Wrangler is really nice on the Cloudflare side. And if you're doing like a minimal, just spinning up a JavaScript file to do some random stuff, Cloudflare is a good bit nicer to work with. You're trying to use a modern framework to build a web application. Vercel is comically easier still. Cloudflare is trying to kill pages and squeeze all the features into workers. They're getting there, but the amount of work I had to put in even just a month ago to try it out was insane in comparison. Another big reason is vibes. I'm not going to talk about politics here. That's not what this channel is for, but a lot of people vibe much more with Cloudflare than they do with Vercel. And as much as that might seem silly, that's a reasonable way to pick the thing you want to use. You should pick tools that feel aligned with the things you care about. And if one of these companies is more aligned with you than the other, you should probably pick that one. That's just reality here. And there's a lot of things that lead into the vibes that you get from these different companies. And I'm not going to tell you to not use the one that you like that's working for you ever. I just want to make sure we're being realistic about the numbers when we talk about these things. I'll also say that the support experience, in particular on Cloudflare, has been really, really good. I am lucky that I have good connections to both companies, pretty high up people at both that will immediately address almost anything I complain about. So I'm in a very privileged spot here. But from what I have heard, people have been very surprised by the quality of support on the Cloudflare side, even if they deeply hate the sales side. I don't know anyone who's had a good experience with Cloudflare sales. I actually know a bunch that have made good friends through the Vercel sales thing, funny enough. Yeah. So you might still have some questions about the benchmark. In particular, how the fuck is it that the sign bench performed so much worse on Vercel when everything else is obviously faster on Vercel? That's a great question. And I asked both Vercel and Cloudflare CTO Dane about what might have been causing this. And right now, the running theory, which none of us have had the time to test just yet, is that an updated version of V8 made some changes that makes it easier to do floating point math in the JavaScript layer. Again, none of us have validated this. This is a theory from the Cloudflare side. They don't know why Cloudflare is faster than Vercel for the original benchmark that inspired this whole video. We were all under the same impression that Vercel is more powerful because they're dedicating real CPUs, and that have built a real benchmark to prove this. Pretty established to be the case. That said, there were some things that were really concerning. I left this run in, even though I've done more runs since, because funny enough, some of the later runs I did actually looked much worse for Cloudflare for reasons that neither I nor them fully understand just yet. This is a screenshot of the observability page inside of the Cloudflare dashboard when I was doing some of these runs. You'll notice most of these make sense. So the left column here is CPU and the right column is wall clock time. So this is how much CPU was run and this is how much time it took overall. You'll notice a consistent like 50 to 150 millisecond gap between these, which makes sense. That's the overhead of just sending things back and forth. So we see here it's like 2.1 seconds of actual CPU and then 2.2 seconds of full time. And that's usually the case. except for sometimes where it'll be like 2.3 seconds of clock on the CPU and 13 plus seconds for the full response. That's insane, especially when you see it's the exact same request happening back to back. Sometimes it just takes way too long, like 10 seconds longer than it should. That variability is killer. It's so bad. And I ran into this a bunch across various different frameworks on a pro account on Cloudflare. Here's a text straight from Dane. Since all the load from your load test originates from the same client, it will hit the same Cloudflare colocation. We normally run one instance of a worker per colo. Since all the load's hitting that one worker, and since a worker is single-threaded, the requests end up blocking each other, which is what caused the performance issue, as in this 13-second spike. We have a mechanism to automatically scale the number of worker instances within a colo if we detect that one instance is not sufficient. However, we believe your load test did not trigger this logic properly because of the unusually bursty workload. Since this is pretty different from normal production workloads, our heuristics were not designed to catch it. We'll need to investigate further and decide if any changes are warranted here. He also sent this article from a couple weeks ago about how they're trying to eliminate cold starts entirely on Cloudflare. This is the thing they're doing where they're trying to reduce how many workers for your code exist in a specific server so that they can keep it running so that you don't have to start it up in the first place for a request. I think this is really cool work. And for most workloads, which on the server side with JavaScript are not bound on CPU, they are bound on the response time from your database. So the best server is the one that is the closest to your DB. As such, none of the things that we're talking about here really matter, which is why this change made a lot of sense. But in the weird specific case of what we're doing, where that worker is single-threaded and that thread is being hammered with random benchmarks, and we're doing this in big spikes, this optimization ends up not being very optimistic for what we were trying to do. This is also likely why Bazut here saw better performance on Nuxt when he moved it to Cloudflare. I'd be very surprised if this is anything other than Cloudflare noticing it made a lot of requests to a thing that it wasn't located near. So they just moved the worker near the data and suddenly it's performing better. That's the only reason an actual complex server-rendered application would run faster on Cloudflare than Vercel, is if it's closer to the data, because that is what makes these applications slow. Not the framework you choose, not the CPU type you choose, not the platform you're deploying on, not even your code a lot of the time. The thing that is slow is the back and forth to get data to the thing that then generates the HTML that gets sent to your user. Now we're through all the technical stuff. There's one last thing I do want to touch on, which is the attack of how I make money and how I pay my team. I can imagine that as an individual developer who writes code for a living that doesn't employ other people, that you don't understand how important it is for your business to make money. But I have a real team now. I have 2 full-time people working on the YouTube channel with me, a bunch of part-timers helping out randomly, and separately a full business that I have to run too. These things are expensive, and we do need to have income in order for them to survive. I make jokes about this when I'm doing my ad transitions because I'm inspired by Linus Tech Tips, and I think it's funny to make a quick joke before we cut to the ad. But I've had enough people like this who just don't get that I think I might have to stop doing those quips. I think they're funny, I'm annoyed, but the goal of how we do sponsors is to be really transparent and show you guys tools that we think are cool and interesting. I don't need to show you guys Vercel. You already know what Vercel is. That's one of the many reasons we broke up. Funny enough, the Vercel breakup, which was instigated by people like this, is the reason every video has an ad. I also wish we didn't need an ad for every video, but since when I did channel sponsors before, as in I had the brands I used and shipped in prod sponsor me directly, the response to that was people flaming me nonstop because they can no longer be trusted. So we moved to a model where there's one ad per video where the ad starts and ends with a timer, and you can clearly tell when the thing that was paid for is over. And then the rest of what I talk about is not paid for in any way, shape, or form. You cannot pay me to talk about or not talk about you outside of an ad. That's it. Would I like if I didn't have to do this? Yeah. But at the same time, we go out of our way to make our ads as interesting and useful to what my audience as possible. And the fact that that is used against me and that somehow makes me less trustworthy because I have mouths to feed and a team to pay, it's kind of bad vibe. And it really sucks that something as important to me as being honest with my community and paying my team well is being held against me as a reason to not trust the hard work that we all do. I got nothing else on this one. I hope this is adequate due diligence for you because it seems like you didn't do your due diligence. You wrote a single realistic benchmark to test T-flops in JavaScript. No one is measuring T-flops inside of a JS VM. They're checking it with native code because that's the point of those measurements. We're talking about real workloads that are very often faster on Vercel, even outside of the weird massive spikes in response times we were seeing on Cloudflare. Quick shout outs before we wrap up. Thank you to the Cloudflare team, in particular Dane, for reaching out and being so involved. Just from one tweet he saw of me sharing some numbers, he texted me early this morning, and we've been going back and forth all day, making this as realistic and quality a benchmark as possible. Thank you to Ben for helping me last night putting together the benchmark, in particular the svelte side, and sanity checking me throughout, because this was very, very frustrating, for being real with you guys. And thank you to all of you for taking the time to listen and give me the chance to debunk this. And to all my supporters who recognized as soon as they saw that video that something was a little bit off. It seemed less like somebody trying to correct the record and more like somebody with a grudge against me for some reason. And that sucks, because it seems like he has a chance as a creator on the space. We need more tech creators. We need more people to double check each other's work, make content about the things that we use every day, and generally share what it's like to do real engineering work in the real world. I hate how unique it is that I'm working on code and a business every day and have YouTube. Ideally, more people would be like me and to share their work in one place in the other. And I really hope that this video doesn't prevent other creators from getting in the space, because this one fucking dumbass couldn't take the time to reach out or do a little bit of actual research. I really hate punching down like this, but I do a lot of work. My team does a lot of work. And to have us disrespected, attacked, lied about, and all of these other things after the hard work we do, it is just incredibly frustrating. I don't let it get to me normally, and I'm trying my best not to here. I hope the numbers will speak for themselves. Let me know what you guys think, and until next time, peace, nerds.